from a general so dangerous that Allied commanders requested reinforcements the moment intelligence confirmed he was in their sector, to a commander whose tactical mind was so advanced that his own side couldn't fully understand what he was doing. These are the 5 most feared Nazi generals of World War II. Chapter 1. The Desert Fox. Erwin Rommel didn't just defeat his enemies. He made them afraid before the battle started. Before we get to the moment British commanders first realised what they were dealing with, you need to understand what fear does to an army before a single shot is fired. It is April 1941. Rommel has just arrived in North Africa with 2 divisions. His orders from Berlin are to hold a defensive line. He ignores them immediately and attacks. Within 2 weeks, he has driven the British back 500 miles, reversing in days what took them months to capture. British commanders sending urgent messages back to London do not describe a military setback. They describe something that does not make tactical sense. Rommel is moving faster than his supply lines should allow, attacking from directions that are not possible given his known positions, appearing somewhere his forces should not be able to reach. They start calling him the Desert Fox. Not as a compliment, as a warning. Winston Churchill told the British Parliament, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and I must say, across the havoc of war, a great general." That statement from a wartime Prime Minister about an enemy commander tells you exactly how deeply Rommel had gotten into British heads. Rommel grew up in a middle-class German family with no military tradition. He earned his reputation through performance, not politics, which made him unusual in the Nazi hierarchy and ultimately cost him his life when Hitler ordered his forced suicide in 1944. He never lost a battle he personally commanded in North Africa. The British learned to fear his name before they learned to stop him. But Rommel fought in the desert. The next general on this list fought across the entire Eastern Front, and what he did there is still studied in every serious military academy on Earth today. Chapter 2. The strategic genius Erich von Manstein was offered command of the German army twice. He turned it down both times because he didn't believe the political leadership would let him actually run the war. He was probably right. There is one plan Manstein submitted to German High Command in 1940 that changed the entire course of the war in Western Europe. We'll get to it, but first you need to understand what the original German plan for invading France looked like. The original plan was conventional: attack through Belgium. Exactly what France and Britain expected, exactly what the Allies had prepared for. Manstein proposed something different. Send the main armoured force through the Ardennes forest, terrain everyone agreed was impassable for tanks, emerge behind the Allied lines and cut off the entire British expeditionary force from the rear. High Command rejected it 4 times. Hitler eventually heard about it and approved it. France fell in 46 days. On the Eastern Front, Manstein's reputation grew further. After Stalingrad, when the German 6th Army had been destroyed and the entire Southern Front was collapsing, Manstein conducted what military historians still call the greatest tactical retreat in history. Outnumbered, undersupplied, fighting on frozen ground in temperatures that froze weapons solid, he stabilised a front that should have collapsed completely. Soviet commanders reported to Moscow that they were not dealing with a normal opponent. They were right. Subscribe before the next chapter. The general coming up built a weapon that terrified Allied tank crews so badly they refused to advance when they knew it was in the sector. Chapter 3. The father of Blitzkrieg, Heinz Guderian, didn't just use tanks differently. He changed what tanks were for. Before Guderian, every military doctrine in the world treated tanks as infantry support weapons, slow-moving armour that helped foot soldiers take ground. Guderian looked at tanks and saw something completely different. Speed, penetration, disruption. Not support for infantry, but a weapon that operated independently, moved faster than any defensive response could manage, and created chaos behind enemy lines rather than fighting through defenses directly. He called it Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. It is May 1940. Guderian's Panzer Corps crosses the Meuse River and drives west toward the English Channel. His orders say to advance cautiously and wait for infantry support. He ignores them and keeps moving. His own high command orders him to stop. He negotiates a compromise and he is allowed to conduct a reconnaissance in force. He uses that permission to advance 50 miles. By the time anyone figures out what he is doing, the British Expeditionary Force is cut off from France and retreating to Dunkirk. Allied tank commanders spent the rest of the war trying to adapt to tactics Guderian had already moved past. He was always one step ahead of the doctrine he had forced everyone else to adopt. What Guderian did to Allied thinking in 1940 took years to undo. What the next general on this list did to Allied infantry in the Ardennes in 1944 still haunts military historians today. Chapter 4. The Most Dangerous Man in Europe. Otto Skorzeny didn't fight battles. He made them unnecessary. Skorzeny was Hitler's personal commando, the man called, when the mission was impossible by conventional military standards. In September 1943, Mussolini was being held prisoner on top of a mountain in a hotel accessible only by cable car. Hitler wanted him rescued. Skorzeny landed 10 gliders on the mountain. Mussolini was free in 4 minutes, not a single shot fired. Allied intelligence was so alarmed by Skorzeny's capabilities that when he disappeared from surveillance in December 1944, right before the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower's headquarters went into lockdown. A rumour spread that Skorzeny had been assigned to infiltrate Allied lines and assassinate Eisenhower personally. The rumour wasn't entirely wrong about his capabilities. Skorzeny had trained English-speaking German soldiers in American uniforms to infiltrate Allied lines during the Bulge, changing road signs, cutting communications, spreading confusion behind American positions. Eisenhower was moved to a secure location and surrounded by additional security. The psychological impact of one man's reputation had effectively removed the Supreme Allied Commander from normal operations for days. Skorzeny was tried at Nuremberg after the war. He was acquitted. Former members of the OSS, America's wartime intelligence service, actually testified on his behalf, arguing that his operations were within the accepted rules of war. He lived until 1975. Allied intelligence tracked him for decades. The most dangerous man in Europe died of natural causes at 67. Chapter 5. The Black Devil. Erich Hartmann flew 1,404 combat missions. He shot down 352 enemy aircraft. He is the highest scoring fighter ace in the history of aerial combat, a record that has stood for over 80 years and will almost certainly never be broken. Soviet pilots called him the Black Devil, not because of cruelty, because of inevitability. There is one fact about Hartmann's record that still doesn't make complete sense to aviation historians. We'll get to it. He grew up learning to fly from his mother, a glider pilot who taught him the basics before he was a teenager. When he arrived at his first combat unit in 1942, his commanding officer considered sending him home after his first mission. He had broken formation, nearly collided with his wingman, and accomplished nothing. He was 20 years old. Within 2 years, he was the most feared pilot on the Eastern Front. Soviet command issued specific orders. Any pilot who spotted Hartmann's distinctive aircraft markings was to break off engagement immediately and flee rather than fight. They had calculated that engaging him directly cost them more aircraft than avoiding him did. The fact aviation historians still argue about, Hartmann was never seriously hit in combat despite flying 1,404 missions in one of the most heavily contested airspaces in history. His explanation was simple. He never fired until he was so close to his target that missing was impossible. Most pilots opened fire at 200 to 300 metres. Hartmann waited until 50. 352 victories. 0 serious combat damage to his own aircraft. a record so extreme it still seems impossible 80 years later. The Soviets held him as a prisoner of war until 1955, 10 years after the war ended, partly as punishment and partly because releasing him felt dangerous even after the fighting stopped. That's how feared he was. 5 generals, 5 different theatres, 5 different ways of making their enemies afraid before the battle even started. Rommel made the British request reinforcements at the sound of his name. Manstein stabilised a front that should have collapsed. Guderian made every Allied tank doctrine obsolete before the war was half over. Skorzeny made Eisenhower go into hiding. Hartmann made Soviet pilots run rather than fight. None of them were invincible. All of them were eventually stopped. But every Allied commander who faced them understood something that took time to put into words, that they were not dealing with ordinary opponents. They were dealing with men who had figured out something about war that everyone else was still trying to understand. Next week, 5 women the SS underestimated. What they did in response still doesn't seem possible. Subscribe. That story is coming.